Maple Ridge, Colorado, December 24th, present day. The silence of a crowded room is heavier than a scream. My name is Hope Keller, and I am lying on the hardwood floor of my childhood home. The air smells of expensive wine and roasted meat, but down here it tastes like ash. Above me, my stepfather adjusts his cufflinks, thinking that by shoving me out of my chair, he has finally erased me from the family portrait. He believes he just won the war. He doesn't realize that by knocking me down, he pushed me right within reach of the weapon my father left behind to destroy him. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The sound of silverware clattering against fine china was loud, but the silence that followed was deafening. I didn't just trip. I didn't just stumble. I was thrown. My hip bones slammed against the cold hardwood floor of the dining room, sending a sharp jolt of pain radiating up my spine. But the physical shock was nothing compared to the sight of 20 of my relatives just sitting there frozen. No one moved. No one rushed to help me up. They just stared, their faces bathed in the warm glow of the Christmas lights, looking at me like I was a stain on the rug that had suddenly appeared to ruin the aesthetic. I looked down at my dress, a deep emerald silk I'd bought specifically for tonight, and saw the dark, bleeding splatter of cranberry sauce across the lap. My phone lay face down a few feet away, the screen likely shattered, sliding across the floorboards like a rejected hockey puck. This wasn't just a fall. This was an eviction. Only seconds earlier, I had been sitting in the chair at the end of the table. It was the same spot I had occupied since I was 12 years old, back when my father was still alive. He used to wink at me from the head of the table and call it Hope's Corner Office, joking that I was already training to take over the family business. But my father wasn't here anymore. The man standing over me now, adjusting his cufflinks with a terrifying calmness, was Victor Hale. He had been my stepfather for 10 years, a man who wore charm like a cheap cologne in public, but suffocated our home with control in private. He hadn't just asked me to move. He had leaned in, his breath smelling of expensive scotch, and announced loudly enough for the entire room to hear that the seat was reserved for his real daughter. Before I could even process the insult, he had grabbed the back of the chair and physically yanked it, his other hand shoving my shoulder with the kind of force you use to break down a door. "Madison needs to sit by the fire," Victor said, his voice devoid of apology as he ushered his biological daughter toward my empty chair. Madison. My stepsister didn't look embarrassed. She looked bored. She smoothed her hair, her eyes glued to her phone, barely acknowledging that her arrival had just sent me sprawling. I looked up from the floor, my eyes locking on my mother, Marianne. For a split second, I saw the mother I remembered, the strong woman who used to run a logistics company. She half rose from her chair, her hand reaching out instinctively. But then Victor turned his head. He didn't say a word. He just shot her a look, a cold, sharp glare that I knew well. It was a silent order, a reminder of the peace she had to keep. And just like that, she sat back down, lowering her eyes to her plate. That betrayal hit harder than the floor. Across the table, my Grandma Ruth gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, but she didn't speak. She had learned the same lesson we all had: don't cross Victor. The humiliation burned in my throat. I felt ambushed. It wasn't just about the chair, it felt like a decade of microaggressions had finally detonated. Beside the buffet table, I saw my uncle holding his phone up, a stupid grin on his face. He was filming me. He probably thought this would make for great drama content on his feed. I realized then that I wasn't a person to them tonight. I was a prop. I was the one they sacrificed whenever the tension got too high. I was the one who moved out first to give them space. I was the one who took the bus so Madison could have a car. I was the one who understood when my college fund mysteriously disappeared while Madison went to art school. "You should be grateful you're even invited, Hope," Victor muttered, taking his seat and pouring more wine, stepping over my legs as if I were invisible. "This isn't your parents' house anymore. It's mine." I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the table and shatter every piece of crystal in the room. But as I pushed myself up, wincing at the bruise forming on my hip, my eyes caught something on the buffet table behind Victor. His work bag was open. A file folder was poking out, and even from here I recognized the logo. It was the old branding for my father's company, something that hadn't been used in years. Beside the bag sat his phone, unlocked the screen glowing with an email app left open. I forced myself to breathe. If I made a scene, I gave him exactly what he wanted: proof that I was emotional, unstable, the problem child he always painted me to be. I stood up, smoothing my ruined dress, and kept my face dangerously blank. As I turned to walk toward the kitchen, ostensibly to clean up, I heard Victor lean toward a cousin and chuckle. "Don't worry," he whispered loud enough for me to hear. "I'll erase her from the photos later. It's like she was never here." He thought he had won. He thought he could threaten my place in this world, and I would just disappear. But as I walked into the kitchen, his words echoed in my mind with a different meaning. He wanted to erase me. Fine. I grabbed a roll of paper towels with shaking hands, but I didn't go to the sink. I quietly slipped back to the doorway, where his phone sat on the buffet just out of his line of sight. With one hand wiping my dress, I used the other to hover my own phone over his screen. I snapped 3 clear pictures of his emails and banking notifications. My heart hammered against my ribs as I zoomed in on one specific subject line that made my blood run cold. R.E. Keller assets transfer. Final step. The bruise on my hip was throbbing by the time I unlocked the door to my cramped one-bedroom apartment, but the physical pain was easier to manage than the memories flooding my mind. Sitting on the edge of my bathtub, icing the purple welt forming under my skin, I realized that tonight's ambush wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the loudest explosion in a war Victor had been waging against me for a decade. My family had been slowly dismantled long before he shoved me out of that chair. It started with the death of the only person who had ever truly seen me. My childhood wasn't filled with country clubs or designer clothes. We were working class and proud of it. My parents ran Keller Transport, a small regional moving and logistics company that my father Daniel Keller had built from the ground up. The company was known for treating employees like family, not line items. I grew up in the dispatch office doing homework to the sound of idling trucks and the smell of diesel and stale coffee. My dad used to sit me on his knee, point to the fleet of trucks in the yard, and say, "You'll run this one day, Hope. You're the only one I trust to keep the heart in this business." But cancer doesn't care about plans. He died when I was in high school, leaving a massive void in the business and a shattering silence in our home. My mother, Marianne, was left vulnerable, exhausted, and drowning in a sea of grief and complex paperwork she didn't understand. That was exactly when Victor Hale appeared. He found her at a grief support group at our church, a predator scanning the room for the weakest prey. He was handsome, attentive, and seemingly full of selfless advice about business management. I watched helpless as he moved from friend to advisor to husband in record time. It started with him suggesting he offer temporary management help with Keller Transport to take the burden off my mother. I remember watching her sign power of attorney forms through her tears, grateful for a savior. But the savior was a conqueror. Over the years, I watched the literal erasure of my father's legacy. The signage on the trucks changed from Keller Transport to Hale and Keller Logistics, and eventually just Hale Logistics. Every time I tried to speak up to ask about the business I was supposed to inherit, I was sidelined. Victor told me I was too emotional to understand the hard choices of business, that I should focus on my own career and leave the heavy lifting to the men. The pattern of favoritism was blatant, but we were trained to ignore it to keep the peace. Madison Victor's biological daughter lived a life of subsidized luxury. At 17, she was gifted a brand new SUV. When she wanted to go to an expensive private college for a degree, she never finished. The money appeared instantly. When she launched 3 separate startups, which were really just expensive hobbies, company funds covered the losses. In contrast, when I needed to get to my classes at the local community college, I was handed a bus pass and a lecture on self-reliance. I worked night shifts to pay for tuition that should have been covered by the family trust, all while Victor guilt-tripped me for not being more supportive of Madison's dreams. I internalized it for years. I thought being the good daughter meant letting myself be sacrificed every time Victor wanted to spoil Madison. I thought if I just behaved, they would eventually treat me with respect. Ironically, Victor's insistence that I focus on my own career forged the weapon I was now holding against him. I became a corporate compliance analyst, eventually rising to a risk officer at a mid-sized firm in Denver. My entire job was spotting patterns, reconciling accounts, and flagging fraud. I spent my days hunting down people who tried to hide money or cut corners. At work, I was respected for my sharp eye. At home, I was treated like a remnant of a past they wanted to forget. But my training had taught me to notice the glitches in the matrix. I remembered when my college fund was supposedly lost to market volatility, yet the same month Madison's tuition check cleared. I remembered seeing the house deed quietly change from Mary Ann and Daniel Keller to Victor Hale. I remembered Grandma Ruth once pulling me aside, whispering, "Your father left things for you, Hope. Don't let anyone erase that," before clamping her mouth shut when Victor's car pulled into the driveway. I snapped back to the present, sitting on my bathroom floor with my stained emerald dress in a pile beside me. I pulled my laptop onto my lap and connected my phone. My hands trembled as I transferred the photos I had snapped of Victor's screen. The images popped up high resolution and damning. I began to scroll. It wasn't just a few emails, it was a roadmap of theft. I saw email chains discussing shell companies, a line item in a spreadsheet called Keller Legacy Reallocation, and repeated massive transfers from the logistics company to unknown LLCs registered in tax-friendly states. He wasn't just cruel, he was a thief. He had liquidated the assets my father built to fund his lifestyle and Madison's whims. Then I opened the photo of the email thread that had caught my eye at the dinner table. The subject line was, "Final Probate Cleanup, Keller Girl." I zoomed in on the text, reading a message Victor had sent to his lawyer just hours before dinner. The words on the screen made the room spin. "Once this goes through, there's nothing she can do. Legally, it'll be like she never existed." I whispered the words to the empty room, the cold reality settling in my bones. He didn't just want my seat, he wanted to officially erase me from my own father's life. The next morning, I drove to Grandma Ruth's small bungalow under the guise of checking in after the disaster at dinner. My grandmother was a woman who had spent her life smoothing over cracks in the pavement rather than fixing the foundation. But when I walked into her kitchen, she looked older than I had ever seen her. She was trembling as she poured me a cup of tea, the china rattling against the saucer. She didn't ask about my hip. She didn't ask about the dress. Instead, she walked to her pantry, reached behind a stack of expired canned peaches, and pulled out a small, heavy, fireproof envelope. She placed it on the table between us like it was a live grenade. "Your father suspected Victor long before he got sick," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. "He gave me this. He told me to give it to you when you were ready to fight back. I was too scared, Hope. Victor is a vindictive man." My hands shook as I opened the envelope. Inside was a heavy brass key and a USB drive. There was also a handwritten note on yellow legal paper. The ink faded, but the handwriting unmistakably, my father's, looping, hurried, and strong. "Hope," it read. "If you're reading this, someone is trying to steal what I built for you. Don't panic. You have my brain and your mother's heart. Follow the paper trail." I stared at the paper, tears pricking my eyes. For years I had felt abandoned, believing my father had simply failed to secure my future. But he hadn't failed. He had anticipated the betrayal. He knew exactly what kind of shark was circling our family, and he had armed me from the grave. I left Ruth's immediately and drove to the bank downtown, the brass key burning a hole in my pocket. The safety deposit box was dusty, clearly untouched for years. When I lifted the lid, the smell of old paper hit me, a scent of legitimacy that had been missing from my life since high school. Inside was the smoking gun, an original notarized will naming me the sole heir to Keller Transport and the family home upon my mother's death or incapacitation. There were bank statements proving the existence of a trust that was fully funded to cover my education money Victor had claimed was lost to market volatility. Beneath that, lay a stack of letters my father had written to a lawyer named Miguel Sandoval, documenting his specific concerns about Victor Hale's unethical interest in the company's logistics routes. I sat in the private viewing room and wept, not out of sadness, but out of relief. My father hadn't forgotten me. He had just been waiting for me to find the truth. Back at my apartment, I channeled my grief into the one thing Victor couldn't control: my professional skill set. I treated my family's betrayal like a corporate audit. I sat at my kitchen table with 3 monitors set up, cross-referencing the photos from Victor's phone with the documents from the safety deposit box. I built a massive spreadsheet mapping the money flows from Keller Transport. I found the patterns: immediately forged signatures on transfer requests, documents backdated to before my father died, and consulting fees paid to shell companies that didn't exist. It was a textbook bleed-out scheme. I spotted the exact red flags I trained junior analysts to catch, only this time the victim wasn't a faceless corporation. It was me. I needed a sanity check, so I called my best friend Jasmine Lee, a paralegal with a sharp mind and zero tolerance for nonsense. I laid everything out on her coffee table an hour later. She looked through the file, her eyes widening with every page. "Hope this isn't just a civil dispute," she said, tapping a printout of a wire transfer. "This is wire fraud. This is embezzlement. Victor can threaten you all he wants, but he's the one who committed actual crimes. You have rights. Fighting back isn't revenge, it's survival." While we were strategizing, my phone started buzzing incessantly. I unlocked it to find a barrage of notifications. My uncle's video of Victor shoving me had made it to the internet. Someone had uploaded it to TikTok with the caption, "Christmas dinner from hell," and it had exploded. Millions of views. The comments were a scrolling wall of outrage, strangers dissecting my family's cruelty under the hashtag #Stepdad from hell. People were calling out the bystanders, my aunts, my cousins, for doing nothing. For the first time, the shame I felt began to shift. I wasn't the clumsy stepdaughter who ruined Christmas. I was the victim of a public assault, and the world was taking my side. Victor must have seen it too. My phone rang, his contact photo flashing on the screen. I answered, putting it on speaker for Jasmine to hear. "You ungrateful little brat!" he hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "You take that video down or I cut you off permanently. I will sue you for defamation. I will ruin your career. Do you hear me?" A calmness settled over me. "You can't cut me off, Victor," I said, my voice steady. "You can't erase what you never gave me. You stole everything that mattered, but you forgot one thing: I know how to read a ledger." I hung up before he could respond. I spent the next hour preparing 3 identical packets of evidence. I included the will, the bank transfers, the shell company data, and the letters to Miguel Sandoval. I mailed the first to Sandoval's office. I mailed the second to the state's Financial Crimes Division. The third went to the IRS whistleblower office. That night, as I sat in the dark of my living room, exhausted, but feeling lighter than I had in a decade, my phone lit up with a call from an unknown number. I picked it up, expecting another threat from Victor. Instead, a calm, authoritative female voice spoke. "Ms. Keller, my name is Special Agent Alana Briggs with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. We need to talk about Victor Hale and what your father started before he died." I met Special Agent Alana Briggs in a nondescript diner on the edge of town, far away from the prying eyes of my family or Victor's associates. She was sharp, concise, and carried a file that looked disturbingly similar to the one I had compiled on my kitchen table. "You weren't the first person to flag Victor Hale, Ms. Keller," she said, sliding a photograph across the laminate table. It was a picture of my father, Daniel, taken weeks before he died, walking out of a federal building. "Your father came to us with concerns about phantom shipments and irregularities in his books. He was building a case to oust Victor right before he passed. We've been watching the company for years, but we needed the internal financial roadmap to tie the fraud directly to Victor's personal accounts. That packet you sent, that was the key." Hearing that my father had died trying to protect his legacy broke something open inside me, but there was no time to grieve. Victor realized the walls were closing in, and like a cornered animal, he lashed out. 2 days after my evidence hit the AG's office, I was served with a lawsuit. Victor was suing me for corporate espionage and defamation, claiming I had used my position as a risk officer to illegally access his private data and sabotage his business. He didn't stop at legal threats. He launched a PR campaign on our family WhatsApp and Facebook groups, painting me as mentally unstable, a jealous stepdaughter obsessed with a dead man's company trying to destroy her sister's happiness. The fallout was immediate and suffocating. My boss called me into his office and placed me on administrative leave pending the investigation into Victor's claims. I walked out of my building carrying a box of my personal belongings, feeling the weight of total isolation. Then came the call from my mother. She was weeping, her voice thick with panic. "Hope, please," she begged. "Victor says you're trying to tear this family apart just when things are finally turning around. Why can't you just let it go? Why do you have to be so difficult?" I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. It felt exactly like that moment on the floor at Christmas, humiliated alone with the people who should have protected me, looking away. I almost caved. I almost told her I would drop it just to stop the pain in her voice. But then I remembered the email, "Legally, it'll be like she never existed." "I did let it go, Mom," I whispered. "For 10 years. I sacrificed myself to keep you comfortable. I can't do that anymore. Not for him, not even for you." I met Briggs again and she gave me the steel I needed to finish this. It wasn't just about my inheritance anymore. Victor had been using Keller Transport's routes to facilitate a massive fraud ring, fake invoices, phantom shipments, and laundering money through small shell vendors. Worse, he was exploiting undocumented workers in the warehouse, threatening them with deportation if they complained about unpaid wages. My father's company, once a pillar of fair employment, had been weaponized against the vulnerable. The showdown happened at the preliminary hearing for Victor's lawsuit. It was supposed to be a standard civil procedure, but the air in the courtroom was electric. Victor sat at the plaintiff's table looking smug in a tailored suit, Madison by his side scrolling on her phone. My mother was there too, refusing to make eye contact with me. Victor's lawyer was brutal, painting me as a vindictive, unstable woman. He flashed curated screenshots of my texts out of context and read a shaky, clearly coerced affidavit from my mother stating I had always been jealous. The judge seemed inclined to agree, frowning at me over his spectacles. It looked like Victor was going to win again. He leaned back, a smirk playing on his lips, thinking he had crushed me. Then the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The sound was like a thunder crack. Every head turned. Attorney Miguel Sandoval, my father's old lawyer, strode in, followed closely by Agent Briggs and 4 federal marshals. The judge paused mid-sentence. Briggs didn't ask for permission. She walked straight to the well of the court. "Your Honor," she announced, her voice ringing off the mahogany walls. "I apologize for the interruption, but there is a federal warrant for the arrest of the plaintiff, Victor Hale." The room erupted. Madison screamed. My mother froze, her hands flying to her mouth. Victor stood up, his face draining of color, stammering, "This is a mistake. That girl is lying. She's trying to destroy her own family." The marshals didn't hesitate. They moved on him with practiced efficiency, spinning him around and cuffing his hands behind his back, the same hands that had shoved me out of my chair. As they hauled him past my table, he locked eyes with me, wild and desperate. I stood up, my legs shaking but my voice steady. "You destroyed this family the day you decided to erase my father." I said loud enough for the record. "You tried to erase me. I'm just putting the truth back where it belongs." As the chaos swirled and Victor was dragged out the side door screaming about his rights, the judge banged his gavel, bringing a stunned silence to the room. He looked at the empty plaintiff's table, then at me, then at the file Sandoval had placed on his bench. "Ms. Keller," the judge said, his tone entirely different now. "In light of these developments, there is one more matter we have to address immediately: the rightful ownership of Keller Transport and your parents' house." The gavel didn't just sound like a judgment. It sounded like an exhale I had been holding for 10 years. The court formally recognized my father's original will and the trust structure Victor had tried so desperately to bury. In the span of a single afternoon, the house and the controlling interest in the company were restored to my name with new legal safeguards that ensured they could never be signed away again. Victor was denied bail, labeled a flight risk, due to the offshore accounts I had uncovered. He eventually took a plea deal to avoid a public trial that would have humiliated him further, but he still received a sentence that would keep him in federal prison for a long time. The news cycle moved on quickly, but for a few weeks headlines about financial abuse and step-family fraud dominated the local papers with my name listed not as a victim, but as the whistleblower who brought him down. The hardest part wasn't the legal battle. It was the wreckage left behind at home. My mother, Marianne, was forced to confront the reality she had ignored for a decade. She went into therapy, and months later she sat me down in her small guest room weeping. She admitted that she had seen the red flags, but was too terrified of being alone again to act. "I chose a predator over my daughter's safety," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I sacrificed you to keep the peace, and I lost you anyway." It wasn't a magic fix, and I didn't offer instant forgiveness, but it was the truth, and that was a start. The relatives who had sat in silence at that Christmas table reached out too. Some sent long, guilt-ridden emails apologizing for their inaction, suddenly ashamed now that their cowardice was immortalized online. Others, the ones who had told me to stop destroying the family, I simply cut out. I learned that sharing blood didn't mean we had to share a life. Reclaiming the company was the first time I felt my father's presence again. I drove to the main warehouse of what was now legally Keller Transport once more. I watched from the parking lot as a crew took down the Hale Logistics sign, revealing the faded outline of my father's original lettering beneath it. When I walked onto the floor, the air smelled like diesel and coffee, just like I remembered. The older employees, men and women who had worked for Daniel Keller, looked at me with cautious hope. I didn't make a speech, I just went to work. I used my compliance background to institute total transparency in the accounting and launched an employee profit-sharing model to pay back the wages Victor had stolen. I wanted to honor the American values my father lived by: hard work, fairness, and second chances for the people who had suffered under a tyrant's rule without the power to fight back. Amidst the rebuilding, I found something I hadn't expected: a healthy connection. I met Evan Morales, an operations manager who had quietly kept the fleet running despite Victor's chaos. We started with coffee, discussing logistics, but it grew into something more: a slow, respectful relationship built on safety. Evan didn't want to control me or erase me. He just wanted to walk beside me. It was a stark, healing contrast to the men who had dominated my life previously, reinforcing that love didn't have to come with a cost. 1 year later, on Christmas Eve, the atmosphere was entirely different. We gathered at Grandma Ruth's house, a smaller, warmer group. The people who were there actually wanted to be there. I walked into the dining room, my breath catching in my throat as I looked at the table. At the end, in the spot that had been the source of so much pain, sat a chair with a small, freshly engraved brass plate on the back: Hope's Place. I sat down, not because I was told to, but because it was mine. Grandma Ruth stood up, raising a glass of sparkling cider. Her hands didn't shake this time. "To the cost of silence," she said, her eyes locking with mine. "And to the courage it takes to break it. May we never again sacrifice one of our own just to keep a false peace." Later that night, as the party wound down, I stepped out onto the porch. Snow was falling softly, blanketing the world in white. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the worn, folded letter my father had left in that safety deposit box. I traced the ink of the final line he had written: "Justice isn't revenge, Hope. It's balance." I looked out at the quiet street and smiled. I used to think I had been ambushed at that dinner table, that I was the unsuspecting victim of a sudden attack. But standing there, the owner of my own life, I realized the truth. Victor was the one who had been ambushed. He thought one shove could erase me. He never realized that by pushing me, he had simply flipped the switch on a contingency plan my father started the day he realized what kind of man had moved into our house. Victor had been walking into a trap for 10 years. He just didn't live long enough as a free man to see who would be the one to spring it. I took a deep breath of the cold, clean air. The balance was restored. And with that final realization of balance, Hope finally closed the painful chapter Victor had tried so hard to tear out of her life. If you found yourself rooting for Hope's long game, let us know what you thought of Victor's ultimate downfall in the comments below. We read every single comment to hear your thoughts on these dark tales. Don't forget to subscribe for more true stories of justice. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.